Hospital nights are filled with an array of odd experiences. As a doctor, I have grown accustomed to brushing off most of them strange noises, flickering lights, and an occasional, unsettling feeling of being watched. These things happen often in the dead of night when the world outside is asleep, and I usually pay them no mind. But that night was different. It began like any other shift. The hospital was unusually quiet, with a stillness that seemed to settle over the wards. Most of the patients were asleep, and the only sounds to break the silence were the steady hum of machines and the occasional footsteps of a passing nurse. My task for the night was one I had been putting off for weeks, sorting through old patient records. There were boxes of files, some dating back decades, stacked high and covered in dust, long forgotten in the archives. I was seated in my cramped office, surrounded by those stacks of yellowing paper, doing the tedious work of organizing and updating the records. The fluorescent light overhead flickered intermittently, casting quick, disorienting flashes of shadow across the room. The work was monotonous, but it had to be done. The room was so quiet that the only sounds were the occasional scratch of my pen on paper and the soft shuffle of files as I flipped through them. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something. There was a flicker of movement in the hallway just beyond the open door of my office. My head snapped up, and I glanced towards the door, expecting to see a nurse or perhaps a patient wandering the corridors. But the hallway was empty. I blinked, staring into the dimly lit corridor for a few more seconds, but there was nothing. Just the long stretch of pale, tiled floor and the cold, sterile walls. I shook my head, dismissing it as a trick of the light or a product of my own exhaustion. It was late, well past midnight, and I had been buried in paperwork for hours. It was easy for the mind to play tricks on you in a place like this. I turned my attention back to the files, telling myself it was nothing. This time it wasn't a flicker. It was a shadow. A tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just stood there, motionless, like it was waiting. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a few moments I just stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was unnaturally still, its edges blurred, as if it wasn't entirely solid. My rational mind told me it was just a trick of the light, some weird shadow cast by the flickering overheads. But then, it shifted. Not much, just a slight tilt of the head, as though it had noticed me watching. That was enough. My skin prickled with fear, and I could feel my pulse racing in my temples. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. The sound seemed deafening in the otherwise silent room. My instinct told me to run, but my legs felt heavy, my feet glued to the ground. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It didn't move. It just watched. With a shaky breath, I grabbed my keys and phone off the desk, my hand trembling as I shoved them into my pocket. I forced myself to walk toward the door, trying to act as if I wasn't afraid. But with every step, the feeling of being watched intensified, like the figure's gaze was boring into my back. As I stepped into the hallway, I glanced down the corridor where the shadow had been. It was gone. The hallway was deserted, the dim, flickering lights casting unsettling shadows along the walls. Despite the emptiness, relief didn't come. The unease still clung to me, thick and suffocating. That presence, it was still there, just out of sight, lingering in the darkness. I didn't dare look back as I hurried toward the exit. My eyes stayed fixed ahead, my footsteps quickening with each passing second. I had to leave now. When I finally reached my car, my hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys. The engine sputtered to life, and I tore out of the parking lot, watching the hospital shrink in my rearview mirror. But no matter how far I drove, the sense of dread followed me, unshakable. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I shut my eyes, I felt it, the presence, the shadow, standing in the darkness, waiting, watching. And deep down, I knew one thing with certainty. It wasn't done with me yet.